WABI, big dummies, 2 words, no qualifications, no diplomatic softening, no carefully worded, media-trained hedge, just 4 syllables delivered by one of the most respected voices in the entire history of women's basketball. And the room went silent before it erupted. That was Cheryl Miller on the All the Smoke podcast. And the moment those words left her mouth, something shifted in the WNBA's public conversation that cannot be undone. Because when a Hall of Famer with multiple national championships, an Olympic gold medal, and decades of player development experience walks into a room and calls your critics big dummies, she is not making a casual observation. She is delivering a verdict. Today, we are going to break down exactly what happened, exactly why it matters, and exactly what it tells us about where Caitlin Clark, the Indiana Fever, and this entire league are headed next. Because this is not just a feel-good story about an icon defending a star. This is a reckoning, one that has been building for over a year and finally arrived with the kind of force that cannot be ignored or reframed away. If this kind of deep, investigative breakdown of what is actually happening inside the WNBA is why you keep coming back, hit that like button right now. It tells us to keep pulling back the curtain on the stories that the mainstream conversation keeps getting wrong. Let's go back to the beginning, because to understand why Cheryl Miller's words carry the weight they do, you have to understand the full architecture of what they were responding to. The campaign of criticism aimed at Caitlin Clark did not start with a single comment or a single bad take. It built systematically, claim by claim, over the course of an entire calendar year, and it was built almost entirely on things that were not true. The first major salvo came before Clark had played a single professional minute, before she was drafted, before she had set foot in a WNBA arena. Sheryl Swoopes claimed publicly that Clark was 25 years old during her record-breaking college season, framing her entire college dominance as a product of age advantage rather than exceptional skill. The implication was pointed and deliberate. Clark was not a generational talent. She was just a physically mature player taking advantage of younger competition, and that advantage would evaporate once she faced real professionals. The problem with that claim was not that it was exaggerated or slightly off. The problem was that it was completely, verifiably, and undeniably wrong. Caitlin Clark was 22 years old during her senior season at Iowa. She played exactly 4 years of college basketball, the same standard timeline as virtually every other senior in the country. When that correction landed from multiple directions simultaneously and loudly, Swoopes retreated into a reference to COVID eligibility rules. But Clark never used a COVID year. She did not need one. She was 22, playing her 4th season, and she was the best player in the country. Full stop. But rather than stepping back and recalibrating after that first factual failure, Swoopes accelerated. The next claim was that Clark was taking 40 shots per game, painting her as a selfish, stat-padding volume scorer who was prioritizing personal numbers over team basketball. The actual figure from Clark's college career was 22.7 shot attempts per game, not 40, not even in the same area code as 40. And here is the detail that makes this particular criticism genuinely extraordinary. Swoopes herself averaged 19.2 shot attempts per game during her own senior college season. She was criticizing Clark for a number that was nearly double the reality, while her own career numbers were only 3 shots per game below the made-up figure she was condemning. That is not a minor irony. That is throwing stones from the most transparent glasshouse in the history of basketball criticism. Then came the scoring record. When Clark closed in on Pete Maravich's all-time NCAA scoring record, a mark that had stood for over 40 years and that the entire basketball world was watching, Swoopes questioned whether the accomplishment was even legitimate. Her argument centered on COVID eligibility, suggesting the extra year available to players made Clark's record somehow less valid than it would otherwise have been. The reality was straightforward and easily verifiable. Clark broke the record in exactly 4 years. She chose not to use the COVID extension available to her. She did not need it. She broke the record on the standard timeline and walked away. None of that context appeared in Swoopes' assessment, and then Clark entered the WNBA. She averaged 19.2 points per game and a league-leading 8.4 assists per game in her rookie season. She won Rookie of the Year. She set records that had stood for decades, and Swoopes went completely quiet. No acknowledgement that the professional predictions had been spectacularly wrong. No recognition that the player she had spent a year undermining had arrived exactly as advertised. Just silence. Many of you have been tracking this pattern for months, and you were right to treat it as something more significant than random bad takes from a former player with a platform. When you line up every single criticism in sequence, the false age claim, the fabricated shot numbers, the scoring record dismissal, and then the professional silence after a historic rookie season, the picture that emerges is not one of honest disagreement or legitimate basketball analysis. It is a consistent pattern of claims that were either factually incorrect, missing critical context, or contradicted by Swoopes' own career statistics. And every single one of those claims got amplified across television and social media in ways that shaped how portions of the audience understood Clark's accomplishments. The basketball world needed someone to step into that conversation. Not just anyone, someone who couldn't be dismissed, someone whose credibility was beyond challenge, someone with the first-hand experience and the Hall of Fame resume to make the rebuttal land, someone with absolutely nothing to prove and no political reason to play it safe. They were waiting for Cheryl Miller. When Miller walked into the All the Smoke podcast with Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson, the energy in that room shifted before she even got to the substance. You could feel it in the forward lean of the hosts, in the way the conversation dropped from casual to consequential within the first few exchanges. Because Miller did not arrive to be diplomatic, she did not come to carefully navigate the political landscape of women's basketball or deploy the kind of calculated language that most public figures reach for when stepping into contested territory. She came with something specific to say, and she said it with the directness that only comes from someone who has already built the most unimpeachable resume in the room and has absolutely nothing to add to it through caution. Come on, you big dummies. 4 words, no qualifications. The studio erupted. Barnes and Jackson, 2 former NBA players who have sat across from some of the most compelling figures in the history of professional sports, reacted with the kind of genuine, unperformed surprise that no television segment can manufacture. Because this was not a prepared talking point or a media strategy designed to generate clips. This was Cheryl Miller saying exactly what she believed, in exactly the language she felt the moment deserved. But here is what made Miller's defense categorically different from every other defense Clark received during that difficult year. It was not loyalty. It was not friendship or political allegiance or a desire to generate attention by taking a popular position. It was honest evaluation from someone who had arrived at the 2024 WNBA All-Star Game with her own preconceptions, her own prior understanding of the Clark narrative, and her own genuine questions about whether the hype matched the reality, and who had then spent extended, intimate, first-hand time watching Clark operate under genuine competitive pressure. Miller was direct about this. She admitted she had questions going in. She knew the numbers were real, but knowing numbers and watching a player process elite competition in real time are 2 different things. What she found when she was standing on that sideline, watching Clark read the game and position the ball before the defense had even registered what was happening, produced a reaction she did not fully anticipate. She was genuinely surprised, and that genuine surprise, delivered with the full weight of Miller's Hall of Fame expertise behind it, is more valuable to Clark's legacy than any statistic in any box score. Drop a comment right now. What specific Swoopes claim do you think was the most damaging to Clark's reputation in the eyes of casual fans who weren't tracking the facts closely? Because the answer to that question matters more than people realize when we talk about what Miller actually fixed with that single podcast appearance. Here is what Miller specifically identified during her time coaching Clark at the All-Star Game. because this section of her evaluation goes well beyond the headline quote and into territory that is genuinely important for understanding what kind of player Clark actually is. Miller described watching Clark pass the ball and being struck by something that does not show up in highlight packages or statistical summaries. Clark sees the game in 3 dimensions. She is processing actions, reactions, and consequences simultaneously, reading what is about to happen before the defense has registered the threat and positioning the ball to exploit the window that is about to open. Miller specifically called out the bounce pass as a weapon that has nearly vanished from the modern game, something Clark deploys with a precision and spatial awareness that separates her from virtually everyone else running an offense at this level. Miller went further. She noted that you can set a screen for Clark, but Clark does not need a screen because her handles and her court vision manufacture the same advantages that screens are designed to create artificially. That is not casual praise. That is a technical observation from one of the most qualified evaluators in the sport's history, speaking from direct, high-stakes competitive observation rather than from broadcast impressions or statistical analysis. Miller also addressed something the loudest critics had consistently and deliberately avoided: engaging with, honestly, Clark's defense. The narrative built around Clark's defensive limitations had been repeated with enough frequency and enough confidence that it had calcified into accepted wisdom in certain corners of the basketball conversation. Miller, who had arrived at the All-Star game expecting to find those vulnerabilities up close, did not find them the way she had anticipated. She described Clark as significantly more aware, more engaged, and more capable as a defender than the version of her that had been constructed by people who needed her to have weaknesses that justified the criticism. That is a meaningful distinction. There is a legitimate version of any analysis that acknowledges real developmental areas in any young player's game. But the defensive critique leveled at Clark was not calibrated. Honest evaluation, it was a constructed narrative, and Miller's first-hand observation did not support it. And if this level of analysis, the kind that actually checks the claims against what a Hall of Famer observed in person, is what you rely on from this channel, consider joining us as a member. Your support is what keeps us going deeper on the stories that other coverage glosses right over. But beyond the basketball evaluation, something else happened during that All-Star experience that Miller clearly did not anticipate when she arrived. She connected with Clark on a human level that went deeper than the coaching relationship and into something more personal and more enduring. Miller spoke about understanding what it feels like to be exceptionally talented and have that talent generate hostility rather than admiration. She spoke about knowing the weight of expectations that nobody asked to carry, about the specific kind of isolation that exists in the middle of a crowd, surrounded by people who are watching you, judging you, and building narratives about you, while the version of you that those narratives describe bears little resemblance to who you actually are. She said she knew what it felt like to be hated, and that recognition, coming not from a sympathetic friend but from a pioneer who had walked a genuinely difficult path through the sport's history, produced something more valuable to Clark than any coaching session. It produced unconditional support at exactly the moment she needed it most. The moment that cuts through everything, all the statistics and arguments and media debates, came when the Indiana Fever secured their first win of the 2024 season. Miller was there. And when she saw Clark in that moment, she did not offer a professional acknowledgement or a coach's congratulation. She gave her the biggest hug she could, and Clark's response was immediate and unguarded. Finally, somebody who's on my side. Read that slowly. This was not a player complaining about criticism. This was not someone requesting protection from accountability or asking for special treatment. This was a young woman who had spent her entire rookie season performing at an extraordinary level, averaging nearly 20 points and a league-leading 8.4 assists per game, while being targeted with inaccurate claims and a sustained campaign of criticism that bore little relationship to what was actually happening on the court. And in a moment of genuine victory, her first emotional response was relief. That one sentence exposes everything the statistics cannot capture about what Clark's first year in professional basketball actually looked like from the inside. If you have not shared this video yet with someone who follows women's basketball, this is the moment. Because the Clark conversation has been dominated for too long by people repeating false narratives, and spreading the accurate version is how the record actually gets corrected. Miller's most consequential observation in that entire conversation was also the quietest one. She pointed out that the crown Clark wears was not self-anointed. Clark did not declare herself the face of the WNBA. The game declared it. The television ratings declared it. The sold-out arenas declared it. The merchandise numbers and the broadcast deals and the cultural conversation that exploded around her arrival in professional basketball declared it. Clark simply showed up, did the work, and the sport responded. And yet she was the one absorbing the hostility that declaration generated in certain corners of the basketball world. The resentment that flows not from anything she said or did, but from the simple reality that her presence made the stakes of the conversation about women's basketball significantly higher than they had been before. Now let's talk about what everyone with genuine foresight in the basketball world is actually paying attention to. Because the Cheryl Miller and Caitlin Clark story is not just a chapter that closes with a viral quote on a podcast. It is a preview of something that could fundamentally reshape the landscape of professional women's basketball over the next several years. When Miller was asked directly about Indiana's future, she did not hedge. She said Indiana has a very bright future coming, and the detail that makes that assessment hit differently than generic encouragement is the weight of who is saying it. This is a woman with multiple national championships, an Olympic gold medal, a Hall of Fame career built on recognizing championship DNA when it is standing in front of her. When she offers that assessment, she is not performing optimism. She is delivering a diagnostic conclusion. What impressed Miller most about the Fever roster was not any individual player's skill set. It was the collective psychological profile of the group. She described this as a team that other teams do not want to play, and she was specific about why. The reason was not raw talent. The reason was mentality, confidence, the absence of fear that she identified as the defining characteristic of teams that compete for championships rather than simply competing in them. They share no fear, she said. They are fearless. And that fearlessness, the willingness to believe in their system against any opponent, to play with the kind of competitive aggression that makes defenses uncomfortable, is precisely what separates talented teams from winning ones. Here is the financial dimension of what Miller's endorsement actually means, because it matters beyond the basketball conversation. Clark's brand is already one of the most valuable individual assets in women's professional sports. Her presence drives television ratings that justify broadcast rights negotiations. Her marketability creates sponsorship value for the Indiana Fever franchise, and every credible voice that validates what the numbers already show, that Clark is the real thing, that the hype is underwritten by genuine excellence, adds another layer of security around that brand value at a moment when the WNBA's next collective bargaining negotiation will significantly reshape what top players can earn. The critics who spent a year manufacturing doubt around Clark's legitimacy were not just affecting her personally. They were creating friction around the league's most valuable commercial relationship at exactly the wrong time. Miller's intervention does not just vindicate Clark as a player, it actively protects the narrative infrastructure that the league needs Clark to represent. The Indiana Fever are not a lottery franchise waiting for their moment. They are a team with extraordinary young talent, a culture of fearlessness that a Hall of Famer identified from the outside, and now the mentorship of one of the greatest minds the sport has ever produced, working directly with its most important player. Championship organizations are built from the combination of talent, mentality, culture, and exactly the right voices at exactly the right time. Indiana might have all four. If you are not already subscribed with notifications turned on, do that right now. Because the next video we are dropping is going to go deep on the specific franchise decisions Indiana's front office needs to make this offseason, to build around Clark before the competitive window fully opens. That is a conversation nobody else is having at this level, and it is coming soon. The false narratives have been challenged, corrected, and exposed, not by a sympathetic fan account or a media personality with an agenda, but by someone with a Hall of Fame career and first-hand competitive evaluation on her side. The numbers told one story, the critics tried to tell another, and the greatest player development mind in the history of women's basketball looked at both versions and chose the one that matched what she saw with her own eyes. The question now is not who was right. That has been answered. The question is who is ready for what comes next, because what is being assembled in Indiana is not a rebuild. It is the beginning of something the league has never quite seen before, and the clock on recognizing it before it happens is running shorter than most people realize.